Jac Saorsa, the author of Narrating the Catastrophe. Narrating the Catastrophe draws out a dialogue between an artist and philosophical inquiry, engaging with Deleuze and Ricoeur, composed of a series of conversations and exchanges. And these exchanges take place between the discrepant positions of the two philosophers, between the practice, drawings, reflections and narrations of the artist and the voices of the two philosophers, between points of significant contact that the text itself unearths, the rhizome, the body without organs, the map and the tracing, and of course the catastrophe. Rather than simply revisiting these points, now becoming increasingly well trodden in the field, Saorsa makes them anew, exploring and opening fresh perspectives by setting drawing practice into meaningful conjunction with Deleuzean theory. So, Jac, how did you come to write the book?
Right, that's quite a long story in the sense that it's come over a long period of time and over a few separate projects on drawing, which are narrated within the book. And it really is a culmination of a move from non-figurative work to figurative work. I use mostly the human form at the moment, and I was interested in my own self as to how I'd come to that from a very abstract approach when I was doing my doctoral thesis. And Deleuze and Ricoeur are generally known as quite separate in their theoretical positions, but I saw a conjunction there, primarily through structure. And Ricoeur's introduction of structure into hermeneutic theory. And that related beautifully with my introduction of structure in my drawing process.
Mm.
So basically I wanted to put it all together, come to a point in my life where I was on the plateau, where I needed to express, and come to that sort of point of intensity where I needed to express it. And thus Narrating the Catastrophe came from that.
So the book draws on a number of practical projects, doesn't it? Drawing on conversation, documenting the stone. Was drawing on conversation, was that your doctoral work?
Yes, drawing conversation was the doctoral thesis. The next one I think in the book is documenting the stone, mapping the mark, then moving into structure in terms of structuring the human form, the human body, and then the figurative work at the end.
Great. So I'm interested, obviously, in the role that narration has in the text, particularly this idea of dialogue. So you talk about narrative as shaping the self. You describe it as a dialogue between the ips and the idem. I don't know if I've said those right. The ways that you use dialogue in recorded text as underlying, kind of informing the drawings. And I think that's when you're talking about drawing dialogue, the doctoral project. You talk about conversation as actually informing the formation of the drawing. So dialogue as a recurring theme, if you like, through the book.
Dialogue and language in general, I think, yes. I mean, it's all about levels of communication, I suppose. The drawing on conversation was drawing directly from dialogue in terms of conversation. And that sense of dialogue obviously has continued through in my seeing Narrating the Catastrophe as a dialogue between myself and Deleuze and Ricoeur. And that's clearly related also to the dialogue that I have with my work as an artist, the dialogue that a viewer has with my work, which are all separate dialogues. And all of those, I think, are based on interpretation in one form or another. And in terms of the idem and the ipse, it's the sameness and selfhood, and this is a Ricoeurian theme, which I think relates quite well to Deleuze, in that Deleuze talks about multiplicity. He denies the sense of sameness and selfhood in a lineal narrative thematic schema. But he also talks about conceptual personae, the idiot, and the ipse, I believe, is relative to Deleuze's character of the idiot, which in turn is in character with the BWO, which is what you achieve at the ultimate limits of interpretation.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to ask you next if you can comment on the role of duration and flux as two distinct entities within the book. You talk a bit about drawing as embodying an instant of time, but at the same time opening onto potentiality.
Mm-hmm. Well, temporal flux and duration. Duration is a specific period, a temporal period, whereas flux is temporal context. And I believe that we all experience within a flux of experience, the multiplicity of experience. You can't step outside of experience. And in experience in terms, again, of my experience as an artist, the viewer's experience of the work. Duration relates to, where I talk a lot about process, the art process. And again, they both enmesh, because in terms of process, it's within the flux and there is no real end. So duration kind of dissipates into flux. I could probably say an awful lot more about this, but it's all kind of in flux at the moment in my head. But it's about interpretation never ever coming to an end. In my mind, it's impossible to finish interpreting something, just as it is impossible to finish a piece of artwork. And I think that's where it comes to the crux of what I'm trying to say in the book, in that I'm arguing with Deleuze, in the sense that he talks a lot about the creative catastrophe as a way to exit the work as an artist and allow it to achieve its own autonomy. And this is where I think here is the rub, because as an artist I don't think that's actually possible. I mean, do you want me to go on about that?
Well, of course I'm interested in what you're saying in terms of the artist's experience and this kind of ongoing process of the work. But it struck me that when you're talking about duration and flux in this sense, and this sense of a drawing opening onto possibility, you were talking not just about your own interpretation as an artist within the work, if you like, but also the viewer coming to the work and reopening it to a different set of possibilities.
Refiguration, yes. Figuration in terms of my creating a work, a figurative work, which evokes the figure with a capital F, which is beyond that, which is the body without organs. But the viewer also refiguring the work in terms of their own experience, in terms of their own interpretations, and realizing something within themselves. If they're able to open themselves up to the work, it reverberates back onto them, and they open up themselves and opens up possibilities for them. There's a whole sort of nub of it. It just continues to open up potentiality and possibilities, and it's never ending. I mean, in terms of my own sense of leaving the work, this is where the problem lies, because I don't think that the work can ever really be free completely of me. I mean, one of the sort of, maybe it might turn into a bit of a cliche in the work, is that, and God forbid we have cliches on artwork, as Deleuze would say, but the masterpiece is created at the expense of the master. I believe that if you create a masterpiece, this is it, this is what I wanted to do, then you cease to be an artist. Because for me, the whole point, the being of an artist is the striving, is the striving for that one piece. But if you achieve it, then what more is there? If you achieve it, then you stop all the possibilities, all the potential. And so this is where I argue with Deleuze, from the point of view of being one of those people that he talks about. He talks a lot about Francis Bacon in The Logic of Sensation. Fantastic book. But I wanted to raise my artist's voice in this book to say, well, just a minute, you were not experiencing what Bacon's experiencing. You are talking about it rather than of it in terms of experience.
Absolutely, and the book comes from a really particular place in that sense, from inside of practice and the outside of the inside of practice and the inside of the outside of practice. This seems like a pertinent point to bring up Professor Challenger, who's a character that comes up in the book, and I'm fascinated to hear more about him, both his importance to your practice and your work, but also he's obviously of central importance to the book.
Don't you just love Professor Challenger?
I do.
He's great. I mean, he's actually an appropriation by Deleuze of a character by Arthur Conan Doyle, Professor Challenger. First appeared in The Lost Worlds. I can't remember now offhand what date that was, which is awful. But nevertheless, Deleuze has appropriated the character, as we all appropriate everything. And in the third plateau of 1,000 Plateaus, the geology of morals, Professor Challenger makes his appearance. And as I've noted in the book, I mean, that chapter, that narration draws shamelessly on this, and also from Logic of Sensation. And also, in some ways, it's a tiny bit autobiographical at the beginning as well. And the inclusion of that chapter in the book, and in the place that it is in the book, I think is very pertinent in that it extrapolates the rest of the book. You can, all of the themes that come up throughout the book, beyond that, and even before that, go back to that chapter, and go back to that consequence of the body without organs, and re-territorialization. Challenger deterritorializes in the end of that chapter into his own work. Really, the whole of the point of the book is encapsulated in that one chapter, and I really enjoyed writing it.
It becomes a really metaphorical marker for the rest of the book, like a reference point that enables the reader to steer their way through it. I think it's a vital...
Yes, I think so.
A turning point, but in a sense of it being a pivot.
Yes, I think so, and they can refer back to it once they've you get to new concepts as the book goes on. They can say, well, you know, that's what that was all about. That's why he deterritorialized. That's the facial aspects at the beginning, and the mouth and the monstrous paunch of Moby Dick, and and also I enjoyed in the book playing with the concept of this, articulating the chapters with the various articulations that seemed completely random, perhaps and off theme, but nevertheless joined, almost like the vertebrae in the human spine. They joined the whole thing together. Without them, there is no body.
So an articulation as a hinge as well as a crack.
Yes.
Good, thank you. I'm wondering if you can make a further comment on this concept of benevolent forgiveness. We talked a little bit about duration and flux, but this seemed to me to be particularly important when bringing together Deleuze and Ricoeur in terms of this idea of opening an artwork, opening onto possibility or potentiality.
Yes, I hadn't actually thought about it at that angle, but yes, you're quite right. When I did think about it, I thought, well, benevolent forgiveness is intersubjective. One of his Ricoeur's aspects of intersubjective recognition, which is translation, exchange of memories, and benevolent forgiveness. And benevolent forgiveness is about the being, your person, forgiving yourself, if you like, you absolving yourself for past acts or whatever, in a quite literal sense, but also in a further extensive sense. And in terms of process, then it would, in terms of an artist's process, it's not so much about forgiveness, but it's about not actually bearing so much import into, for instance, marks made, literally, not regulating yourself, not being so pedantic that every mark has to be correct. And this leads straight into Deleuze's random diagram and the importance of marks and involuntary actions. And that opens the work up to potential, as benevolent forgiveness opens your person up to potential. You don't have obstacles, you're not dragging around such a lot of baggage that actually affect what you do in the future. I mean, this is the way that I see that link from a personal perspective. I mean, obviously that's one interpretation, isn't it?
That's great. I want to ask you to say a little bit more about hermeneutics within the book. Obviously it's massively important in terms of the way that you work with Ricoeur's writing. But at one point in the book you say that the Deleuzean rhizome can be accommodated within the hermeneutic arc that Ricoeur deals with. And I'm interested in how you see those two systems building into each other or being accommodated within one another.
Well, I think the hermeneutic arc is incredibly important, and it's a kind of transmutation, if you like, from the circle. I don't think that Ricoeur ever denied the circle, but he created the arc in order to integrate structural analysis and move from understanding and explanation to explanation and understanding backwards and forwards. And I think in terms of the Deleuzean rhizome, I think that there's a relation in that there's obviously never any closure. There's obviously tangents and other sort of factors that come into it, which in an arc, I think, is able to encompass that. I mean, I say later on that it's not about closure in the circle itself, and the circle then becomes the room of the abyss, but that's sort of moving on a bit. So, I mean, it's perhaps you know, some people might consider it contrived, but from an artist's perspective, I do think that it's incredibly pertinent, the relations that can be seen between Ricoeur and Deleuze, rather than simply polarize them immediately. I think it's probably better to work with what is perceived as the non-relation between them, which is actually more interesting than just saying there is no relation.